Hey, Yujan. Good morning.
Morning. How's it going?
Hey, it's going well. Yeah, I just got off a practice webinar run for a webinar next week on AI. It's kind of more focused on reimbursement, but
Yeah, I'd be very curious to hear what you had to say about that.
yeah, well, I'm on the reimbursement side specifically. I'm mostly just listening. Um, but it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, yeah, definitely. If you want to make a big difference, like it has to pay for itself. Like your product has to have product market fit. You can't just put that as an afterthought, you know. Um, so yeah, I think that's super important. Although not perhaps not the most interesting technically, but definitely impact wise, it's like a prerequisite to have. So very cool. Yeah, well I've got my coffee in hand. I don't know about you. I don't know about everyone else, anyone else watching, but yeah, we're good to go. We have the brain juice ready. Where I'm going to kick things off. So today's topic is about Gen AI. We titled it "What is a Gen AI enabled device?" But we're going to go into more than just that. So can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So actually, David told me about this digital health advisory committee meeting that's going on next week. And I'm going in person to this meeting. And this is my first time going to these meetings. So I don't know exactly what to expect, but I believe what it is that the FDA is getting feedback from the industry on how they should regulate or just some advice on what the industry is thinking about this new technology. And I guess the idea is that that would inform FDA and their in like the future guidances and stuff that they'll put out on this topic. So this is publicly available. Anyone can go to this URL and this URL talked about what this advisory committee is about, what are the specific items that FDA wants to talk about. And also, if you scroll all the way to the bottom here, you can download some documents that goes over what the FDA thinks about it and what the questions they want the public to answer or help them or provide feedback for them. As we'll see, FDA has done a lot of thought on this already. They've actually come to us with their thoughts on Gen AI, which to my understanding, it's like the first, by the way, this is not a guidance document by any means, but it's the first time that I've seen a concrete like statement from FDA telling us what FDA thinks about Gen AI and enabled devices.
Yeah, I think
So we'll be,
I'd
yeah,
second that. As far as I'm aware, that I'd agree it's the only thing, and it's pretty good. I actually, just for full disclosure, I've only read probably two-thirds of it. So I didn't finish the last part, but yeah, I think it's a pretty great document. It has some useful gems in it.
yeah, definitely, definitely. I like to start out with yeah. So I guess the point of this talk is to go over FDA's questions. They have some questions that they laid out for industry about what the panel discussion is about. So I'm just gonna go over some of these. I mean, I guess this like we'll just be going over these questions and talking about them. I'll go over kind of my thoughts on some of these, and I'd be very curious to hear what David thinks about them, and also what you guys think about them as well. So let me pull up this diagram that I've got going on here. And so, okay, so the panel questions is about Gen AI enabled devices, but before we dive into that, what is a Gen AI enabled device? Well, according to FDA, Gen AI enabled devices are the med devices that fall under the definition of a device that uses Gen AI. Then that goes back to, well, what is Gen AI? And this is what they have to say about that class of AI models that emulate the structure and characteristics of input data in order to generate derived synthetic content. I think actually reading how they use it in the paragraph, I think kind of clarifies it a bit better for me. Where they say, yeah, Gen AI can create new derived synthetic content, and it's usually meant to create new data that resembles the data it learned from, instead of just identify patterns. Also, and I think this is important, and to me, this is probably like the clearest definition I think of what Gen AI is that importantly, Gen AI models are frequently developed on data sets so large that human developers cannot know everything about the data set it contains during development. And I think that's like the clearest definition to me, at least. Like whenever we say, like I tried to better clearly define, well, what does it mean to be synthetic and that looks like the data it learned from? Because you could argue that current generation it creates outputs that looks like the inputs. I mean, that's like what what like machine learning is supposed to do, right? So I couldn't really have a crisp, right? I couldn't come up with like a crisp definition, like to tease the two apart.
Well,
So kind of fallen back.
I think Yujan, can I ask a question?
Yeah,
So could you contrast this with just a normal AI enabled device? Um, so like what would
yeah,
be an AI enabled device that does not incorporate Gen AI, and how does it not meet this definition?
yeah. So I think so. Okay, so like a non-Gen AI enabled device. Let's say that this is a CT segmentation algorithm, right? So we have CTs, and we're also going to have ground truth, which is going to be the, let's say, prostate segmentation, right? So during training, like you'll use both of these to train, right? And this applies to any AI, not necessarily just Gen AI. And then like the output of this would be would be prostate segmentations, which you could argue like doesn't this resemble what this was trained on? Maybe what they right, like if you read it, hold on, what is it? To that class of AI models that emulate structured characters of input in order to generate derived synthetic content. Um, and then if we read here, mimic the structured characteristics of input data. I guess that's what synthetic content means. It's like it's something that mimics the structure and characteristics of input data. Anyway, like I thought this distinction because like I know, I guess I think I understand Gen AI when I see it, right? It's like ChatGPT, something that's producing something that mimics the input, right? But then if you try to create a definition around it, like it seems like the current generation, like I'm not sure how to really qualify this definition more. Maybe it's like probabilistic or it could generate something different, something new every time. I don't know, but I think it needs a little bit more workshopping to really narrow that down. However, the second part seems a lot more clear to me. That more importantly, if your AI algorithm uses this data set so large, yada yada, which they also call foundation models, then that's characterized as Gen AI.
So
Yeah,
in the past, like for a while, I'd always heard the distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning, and I feel like unsupervised learning isn't something that I hear talked about a whole lot more, but in a way,
yeah,
like because it seems to me like a lot of the AI products that we work on in the radiology space, it's very clearly supervised, right? You have here's the image, and then here's the right answer that's produced by the radiologist usually, and then you try to train it to then get the right answer and you do that on the data sets where you know the answer because the radiologist did it. And then the hope is now you give it a new data set that the radiologists haven't looked at and it gives you the answer. So you need to have the supervised thing. But obviously with like
yeah.
ChatGPT in particular, you just have blobs of text and it's just predicting the next the next so would you call I mean this I hope I'm not getting off on a tangent here, but would you consider like Gen AI supervised or unsupervised?
I think it's still supervised training because you have labeled data. Like labeled data is free, right? But in like the corpus of text that it was trained on, it just generates its own supervised data set. They call that self-supervised. But like how the but like how the LLMs are trained is they mask out like the rest of the paragraph and then they train the AI to then predict the next token. But
Then
they know what the next token is. So it's actually not unsupervised. I think it's more I think they call it self-supervised. To my understanding, all of these foundation models, I don't want to say all, but I think most of them are self-supervised in that there's already like a large set of data and they just like mask out text or they mask out an image or they mask out a frame in a video and then they just have the transformer AI architecture predict that masked out data, but it's all still supervised. Yeah. Yeah. So this one's kind of a strange one. Like it seems easier to tease the two apart, but I don't know. I think there's a lot more neural nuances there that I hadn't really had time to really think about. Kind of moving on to the panel questions. So FDA asked, please discuss what specific information related to Gen AI should be available to FDA in order to evaluate safety efficacy. And this is like a group of questions. So there's not a question here, but this is just on the pre-market side. They're asking some questions here. And I just have this diagram here. This is from FDA. They're just looking at the AI total life cycle, which includes design development, V&V, and then probably add that right after here, right after there is typically where clients get like a 510K or they do some sort of pre-market submission is right at this point. And then after that is in the post-market. So and then as they show here, this is a loop. Like once you're done, like you're not going to be done completely with it, and you're going to keep iterating on your product, and which is the point of this diagram here. And then this one here, they talk about they just break it out into more concepts on this, and they show that this is a cycle, and there's going to be little checks and gates between the two, between all these phases. So anyway, this is what FDA means by pre-market, and also this is what they mean by total product life cycle is what we see here. The first question FDA asks, what information should be included as part of a device description or characterization in the pre-market submission device enabled by GenAI? For example, when a human is or is not in the loop, or a device is intended only to recall versus generate new recommendations, what information is particularly valuable to evaluate the safety and efficacy devices enabled with Gen AI compared to non-Gen AI. So like my kind of go-to, like I have these diagrams that we use to describe AI-driven devices, and I think it applies to Gen AI and also non-Gen AI. And for those who haven't seen it, this is also available on our website. We have like data sets. These are like training data sets or testing data sets. And we have data. These are like individual images or pieces of text or whatever. Also, I think highlighting device outputs is good, and also external systems, so get it compact and whatnot. And then here in green are non-machine learning based algorithms, and in dash are things that require manual interventions. So this would cover like the human in the loop that we're talking about here. And then in blue is anything machine learning related, and in solid blue that is non-soup or this is machine learning trained in-house from scratch, or that at least you have full provenance over everything. And then in dash is machine learning that you don't have provenance over everything. So this is something like using off-the-shelf ChatGPT, or using something off-the-shelf like something you've downloaded from GitHub or whatever. I think the same thing, like what information should be included. I think the same thing you should try to do the same exercise, go and figure out what data was used to train the model, how the data flows through your system, how you call, like fully lay out all of the machine learning components you use, you develop both in-house and also off the shelf. And yeah, I don't know. I kind of think like, well, this is kind of everything that you used to do. How much different is Gen AI, other than the fact that you're going to have a much bigger black box with this component here, where you have this external component that's off the shelf that you don't really have control over. That obviously is a much bigger black box than it used to be. But other than that, like I'm not sure if there's really much inherently different on like the algorithm description side. I think risk, as we kind of come down to later, there's some differences there, but for the device description, I don't know. I couldn't really think of too many more differences, to be honest. On
What do you think? What do you think about this? So presumably, make this more concrete. Let's think of like a foundation like imaging model where like with a lot of the AI models we've done now, we know the data set completely and it's all relevant for the intended use, right? Like if we're segmenting atherosclerosis and a CT like that. We know all the training data is for that. But in these foundation models, the data that's going into training them is a lot broader. Like and it could be for a whole bunch of things that aren't related to the particular intended use of this device. So I would imagine that
Mhm.
just describing the training data, like the way you describe it, will have to be kind of different because there's just so much more of it. And in the past, again, it was all related to the intended use, but now it's for all sorts of things. And so do you have to like go into like it seems like just a lot more effort will go into describing that. Does that and
Yeah,
is it valid or not? Like,
yeah,
do we just pull a whole ton of clinical data? Like, do we just go into several academic medical centers and just pull all their data, right? Like,
right.
I could imagine just the visibility, the transparency, and the information around that maybe different. What I don't know. What do you think? Is that
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's definitely going to be different because it's also like not as known. It's that's definitely like where a lot of differences are for sure. Is this the scale of training data, um, and that ties into like FDA's definition of foundation models and also their definition of Gen AI, which uses foundation models. You know, they say that like a developer can't possibly or can't fully understand or something about like the data that was used to train it. And they also talk about this in their comments here, where they say this for Gen AI enabled device training, this may include information, and this is important, as reasonably as possible pertaining to data management and model development for the initial foundation model. So I think that's what you're talking about is the data management model development for the initial foundation model. And here FDA is conceding that like, hey, this is actually really difficult to get. And we're not expecting you to, you know, drive up to Facebook and like ask them to give you exactly what data was used to train the model. Like, you know, they're conceding that this is not probably not possible. But like you're right, like at least you should make a reasonable effort to figure out what was used there. Some of these foundation models are more open than others, and they've published what types of data used or data that they've used, but others are pretty closed.
and like one thing we've seen for like when there's companies selling off the shelf commercial off the shelf software to medical device manufacturers is they will provide kind of a lot of information to the companies buying the software. So like for
Mhm.
example, like there's some off real-time operating systems that are meant for medical devices, and they'll have a lot of like validation documentation that's aligned with how FDA expects it. So what do you think if there are companies, and we know there are, because we've talked to some of them who are building foundation models for the radiology space for them, like they're not going to be clearing their software or their models directly. In many cases, they'll be selling them to other medical device manufacturers. Like, do you think there'll be an equivalent thing where there's like an expectation that, hey, you're going to have to disclose all this kind of validation documentation for our MOOP, like, and versus because like you're right, like if you're thinking about like Llama or OpenAI for like maybe like those types of things, like you're probably not gonna get that much visibility into it.
Yeah,
But
yeah. If I were the one purchasing such a specific foundation model, yeah, I would want to make sure that whatever I use it for, that I would be able to commercialize, and therefore probably one step of that is getting FDA clearance. And if I can't get it FDA cleared because they're not sharing this information, it seems like that's not a reasonable outcome, or that's not a favorable outcome for both parties, right? So I would think that the people making the base foundation model would want to make it easy as possible for their customers to get FDA cleared. Therefore, they would want to make that data available. It doesn't need to be all the data, right? Like it doesn't need to be the raw data, but just say that we got, you know, X amount of CTs or MRs from this site. Here's the demographic breakdown of all the data, things like that. I think it is reasonable to expect, and I think advantageous for both the foundation model developer and also the customer. So
it seems
yeah, I think it's a great point.
it's analogous to like, hey, we're not going to give you the source code, we're just giving you the binary, but we are going to give you like some validation documentation that describes it at a high
Yeah,
level, kind of like.
yeah, 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 exactly. All right. I think we have some questions, but we can just kind of entertain some questions because they might be related to what we've discussed so far. So Rama would like to get a link to the reimbursement webinar. Yes, we can certainly send you that. Also the link to the diagram. Yes, it's on our website. Um, and I can paste it into the chat in a little bit. So Walter asked, what about the intellectual property concerns an investor would consider in addition to FDA clearance? I'm not sure if I have the knowledge to really answer this one. I don't know, David, do you have any thoughts on this one? Intellectual property concerns an investor would consider in addition to FDA clearance.
Yeah, well, yeah, to be honest, Walter, that's outside of my space too. Like we're typically really focused on the product development and the FDA regulatory side, and then we bleed a little bit into reimbursement and bleed a little bit into IP, but we're not, I wouldn't say really qualified to say a whole lot there.
Yeah,
It's
sorry about
certainly
that.
specific concerns for foundation models around like the training data that was used and like how, but like I think that's, I know like lots of people are talking about that and thinking about it, but certainly wouldn't know
Yeah,
typically anything about that. Um, it seems like an
yeah,
important question though.
and like just to show how much I don't know about this, but I've heard there was a court case where like they like I believe like there was a court case showing or arguing is the fact that like Google scrapes all the data from these sites and then trains a foundation model on it. Is that copyright infringement? I think the outcome was no, that it wasn't, that the judge ruled in favor of the foundation model. But I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure if that's the pathway that you're thinking about. Okay, see, there's another question from Walter. How could providing further data and technical details potentially compromise intellectual property protection? Yeah, again, I'm sorry, I I don't really know yet. I think the answer to that.
But I think
Um,
one thing we could comment on is it certainly like if we're thinking in the context of a company developing a foundation model having to disclose some details to medical device manufacturers that use that model, that sort of disclosure I would say is pretty expected. Like I think like certainly there's kind of a status quo and that if you have, okay, how to say it. So like FDA has an off-the-shelf software guidance where they talk about using off-the-shelf software that you've bought from a vendor in a medical device. And there's different levels of risk related to using that off-the-shelf software. And at the higher level of risks, one of the things that's required is that you have some visibility into the product development lifecycle of that software. And that typically involves disclosing a certain amount of information about how it was put together. And I think that's kind of an expectation that you'll need to provide more visibility than maybe you would in other industries into how your software works. And I would imagine there's a similar thing that would happen with models of unknown provenance, that if you're trying to sell a foundation model, you're going to just have to expect to disclose more. But I think whether what the intellectual property protections around that are, like if you're using it as a trade secret versus a patent, like I don't really know. I don't, hopefully that's at least somewhat useful, but great. Looks like there's another question.
yeah, so for SAMD, for AI SAMD design controls, you typically see manufacturers separating their design traceability matrix into product specific for software and technical requirements and process regulatory specific requirements separately. Or do you typically see quantitative or qualitative DTM?
So I think I can say a few comments on this. So we typically don't include like process specific requirements in our design traceability matrices. we'll often have, like for our internal audits of our quality management system and our processes, we'll have our own kind of traceability matrix where we trace from regulatory requirements to the processes and the evidence that those processes have been followed. And that's usually operating at a higher level than a particular product. But yeah, we typically don't mix those because I think the verification step of each of them is a little different, and the timing of when you do them is a little different. So I generally don't like to mix them. Although I have seen companies do that quite a bit. Um, and especially if you're a startup and you only have one product, it may just be simpler to do it that way. But I don't know if that answers your question. But
Yeah, and like on the question of quantitative versus qualitative, I don't separate them out. Like they're both either verification or a validation, but I don't separate out, at least in separate matrices, quantitative versus qualitative.
yep.
Cool. So yeah, thanks for the questions. If you have any more, please type them in and we'll answer them later. Um, so the other question FDA has is, what evidence specific to Gen AI enabled devices should FDA consider doing pre-market evaluation regarding performance evaluation and characteristics of training data during the total product life cycle if the device is safe and effective? So again, like this touches on our previous talk about if it's not possible to get the foundation model, and also brought up there's potentially other legal roadblocks too in getting it. I think what FDA is asking here is, yeah, specific to the data, what can be done, I guess. Like they're just trying to expand on that our previous point. I think that like the one thing I could come up with is some assurance that the training set has not been contaminated with your test set. And this is definitely a phenomenon seen in the large language models, and that there's these benchmarks that are public, and you'll see over time all the algorithms perform better over time. But then there's benchmarks that are sequestered from the internet, and there's a big difference between the model performance, and you wouldn't expect that. There's also been other papers published where like even it's seemingly small changes to the questions, like changing names and changing things that like a human wouldn't even really notice, seems to make a big difference on performance. Um, so yeah, what I could think of like a simple thing is just to make sure that the test set is not on the internet, and reasonably sure that I guess it wasn't used to train a foundation model. Yeah, I think that was like the main thing that I could come up with on this. Like, how do you what evidence regarding training data can you provide specific to Gen AI? I mean, obviously the stuff that's not specific to Gen AI is like, where your training data came from. Does it properly represent your device intended use? And I mean, all that stuff is still there. But specific to Gen AI, I don't know. Kind of the best I could come up with like the time that I gave to think about it. I don't know, David, if you have anything else that you think should be in this.
Yeah, I have some more thoughts on the performance evaluation part, but as far as the training data and like
Yeah.
understanding that, I don't know. I mean, I do think in general, it's like, yeah, ideally we would know more about the foundation models. And it really comes down to risk benefit analysis of like, well, okay, yeah, everyone, the FDA, manufacturers, everyone would wish we knew more. But if the benefit's sufficiently high, like does that outweigh the risk of us not knowing that information? And that I'm sure
Yeah.
the later questions will kind of get in, yeah, get into that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. And I'll touch a little bit on that. Like this is what we're talking about here is pre-market. Um, but I think pre-market and post-market combined is going to be a very important thing for anyone getting this FDA cleared. Because I think to make that case, like, hey, like we don't really know much about this other than here's limited pre-market data that we show that, hey, this looks like there's a high likelihood of a high benefit to risk ratio, but we'll follow that up with a promise of post-market data and post-market surveillance, kind of like how drug trials are phased in. You know, we say that there's a post-market one, and with these two combined, that lowers the risk of getting it cleared now. But yeah, I think we'll talk more about that later. Here's another question from FDA. What new and unique risks related to usability may be introduced by generative AI compared to non-gen AI? What, if any, specific information relevant to healthcare professionals, patients, and caregivers is needed to be conveyed to help improve transparency or control these risks? So definitely hallucinations is what first comes to mind for me. And that's where the LLMs produce false information that looks very, very compelling. I think that's the main unique new usability risk. And then the second question, I think clearly annotating what was AI generated and what's not would really help. And like kind of tracking that through through like the user interface that people know that, hey, this is like AI generated or not. Also citing references for where that content came from. um, Doing things like a confidence score where you can say like, hey, we're like 95% sure that this was said in the transcript, or 50% or whatever. Also, I think human training, like we should not be using Gen AI without sufficient context, like Google. Like it's not you type something in, there's no context. You couldn't rely on that information coming out. But I think there still needs to be a lot of training involved, in just the general public, and like how to really use it effectively to reduce the likelihood of having these hallucinations. And kind of likewise to that, I'm thinking that the transparency of what went into the context, so that the user could analyze like the likelihood of hallucinations. Like if you didn't have the medication list in the context, but then you get a medication list out the other end, that's probably unlikely, or that that should be suspect. But anyway, there's probably a lot more controls that we could think of, but these are kind of some common themes.
So
I don't know, David, if you have any other ideas on that.
yeah, I've got several other things. So or thoughts. So on the usability topic specifically. So like I think one thing with the generative AI, especially like a text-based generative AI tools, to be more specific, that because they're so general purpose, the boundaries between what it's intended for and what it's not intended for are a lot blurrier. And I know FT talks about that quite a bit in their document. But I think like just in the past, but before generative AI, it's just technically it's hard to make tools that are so general purpose. So like usually it was more obvious that hey, like this can only really do the one thing it does, right? Like, and it's not as likely like you if you try using it for something else, it just wouldn't work. And so I think that the risk, the usability risk of someone just starting to use it for something that it wasn't intended for goes up. And I think for when you think about like foundation models, like foundation imaging models used in the radiology space, some of those problems aren't really there. Like that's more specific to like a text-based interface. Because like let's say you use the foundation model and then fine tune it on some specific task, and the whole like and then the output of the model is hey, you get some CTN and then it spits out a report. Like none of those risks are there, even though it is using generative AI. It's just using generative AI to perform better with less training data. And in that case, I think it's more or less the same. It's as what we're doing already. It just probably will work better. But I think
Yeah.
maybe another case is if you just say, hey, I want to send you an MRI, like a chest MRI, and it just annotates everything as if it was a radiologist, which I know there's people working on this sort of stuff. You read about it online. I mean, that's probably another situation where, if the FDA says, hey, we only approve this for these areas, then what happens when the radiologist isn't aware that, oh, it's actually annotating something it wasn't supposed to, and I'm just going to believe that it actually works. So then that risk maybe comes back into play. Um,
I'm gonna call that much easier predicate creep. Is that a term? I don't know. But this is what that reminds me of. It's like FDA approves one thing or clears one thing, and then that device slowly kind of creeps, and more things get added to it over time. Like the main check and balance on that is it's hard to create new features, but now we're saying that, oh, you can just repurpose it so it like amplifies this problem.
yeah.
Like I've seen, yeah, like I've seen devices that we tried to predicate on, but they were cleared like 15 years ago, and they only had one clearance. That was version one, and now they're up to like version 12, and it does something completely different. It does a lot of different things. Maybe like over time, like yeah, it's like note to file, note to file, note to file, and then it gets to being completely different.
Yeah.
But it seems like this will kind of amplify that effect. Which
Yeah.
yeah, like yeah, yeah,
You that yeah, no, I think that's another risk. Maybe it's not a usability risk per se, but but I think like another usability risk is like if we think about like using Cursor or GitHub Copilot, like I think some of the things that make those uses of generative AI so nice is that you can iterate quickly. Um,
hmm
and so I'm just thinking about usability. Like I think having the generative AI, like being able to handle when it's wrong and making it really easy for someone to review it is helpful. Like this is really software specific, but with this cursor tool, one of the things that it does is it makes it really easy to like rerun a prompt and then see what's different. And so it makes it easier to kind of check that it worked well. And like I wonder if there's similar situations in clinical uses of generative AI where if it's an iterative process where the user is kind of interacting with the generative AI, if there's some controls or some usability features to make it easier to evaluate, hey, did it work well? Now, I haven't seen any applications that are like that in the clinical space where you're like interactively doing it. Like, I don't know if you, John, if you have you seen anything like that or
No, I haven't seen anything like Cursor in like clinical space. Yeah.
we had someone asking us about glass health, which is interesting. They're a startup that's raised, I think they're Y Combinator based, and it's supposedly clinical decision support. And I don't know if it's like the sort of thing where you can kind of like edit it, like yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, this seems to be more like searching for evidence-based medicine, right? I mean, this is what it's saying. It's just combining large language models with peer-reviewed guidelines and stuff. It's not making specific claims about like a patient or you know. Seems like this one's a little bit like this may not even be considered a medical device, perhaps.
Yeah, I hadn't. So when you say draft differential diagnosis,
I kind of think of that like Google, like you're going to Google. Yeah, I mean, drafting. Yeah, I think this is actually perhaps more of a gray zone than maybe at first look. But yeah, this I think this might be a topic in and of itself, like figuring out is the Gen AI
yeah,
considered
yeah,
med device or not?
abs
Um, and and also FDA talked about it too. They talk about there's like three categories that they bring up. Ones that are clearly not a device, and then it's kind of the same as like the CDS guidance they had before. But yeah, here like some Gen AI that do not meet the definition, some that meet the definition, but we're not going to worry about it. And then there's others that meet the definition and we are going to worry about it. And that's what they're focusing on. And they go into some details about what cost. I'm thinking like as an I don't know if this is an educational tool, but it kind of got me thinking like if it is an educational tool kind of thing, maybe it's not considered, but it's not clear on exactly what class AI is. And I think that definitely depends on how it's being used.
and the yeah,
Um,
marking claims and everything. Like
Yeah, exactly. So kind of going back to this, the one more thing I want to talk about for like usability is the detectability of errors. And I think it's not uniform. Like I think like the virtual scribes is kind of what got me thinking about stuff where there's speech to text. Oh, sorry, my mouse fell. The speech to text error I think that one in particular is really difficult to detect. Like if there's an error, I can't see like a busy clinician going back to the recording and like verifying it unless they check the transcript right then and there where it's still fresh in the mind. But but unless they yeah, I just don't see that like I think the detectability of that kind of error is low. So like the probability that sequence of events goes without the physician detecting, I think is higher. I think it's different for like each of these different ones. Like if you had a segmentation algorithm, but because you have the image right there with the segmentation, it's a lot easier to detect those types of errors. But I think the one related to ambient scribes is particularly hairy. I think that's like another usability concern is to try to evaluate what is the detectability of this. And I think this is a human factor concern. Like I just don't think busy physicians are going to really do that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
you
that's
know,
a yeah, I think it's a great point because the harder it is to do, the less likely you are to do it if you're busy. And I know for myself, just using ChatGPT versus GitHub Copilot, like early on, right, you would say, hey, ChatGPT, write me a script that does this and this and this, and you do it and then paste it in. And that works well. But then when you have Cursor where it's tightly integrated into your editor and you can quickly see the diff of like, oh, here's what it's changing, you're like, oh, it's way easier to check that. And because it's easier to check it, it's more usable. That risk on that second arrow on the sequence of events there, like is I
yeah,
think that's what you're saying. I think it's kind of like, but for like the audio, yeah, like it's yeah, that's a good point too, that the control being like, hey, you have to do this. Like, we're only going to let you do this if it's immediately after. Like, you just talk to the patient and then you go out and the clinician has to review it then. Otherwise, it just disappears and then they're going to have to re-listen and do it themselves. Maybe that would be a
right.
way to like enforce that as a risk control. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, maybe. I think one other way is again post market. Like if you store the recordings and you can like in the post market as these LLMs get better, you say, well, oh shoot, like this was actually a transcription error, and it like it affects care. Um, I think there's some legal reasons why people won't want to, why the companies won't want to do that, but for safety reasons, it seems like that's the right thing to do. Well, which is I think why like FDA is putting a lot of emphasis on the post market. Like they want to get this device, they want to get these devices out there, um, because the benefit is clearly there. But to get them out there sooner without a bunch of pre-market evidence, pushing that to the post-market, I think is makes sense, and it's a more sustainable way to do it too, I think. But anyway, kind of getting to an aside there about my opinion, which don't necessarily matter. I think this question here, I'm gonna skip this just for the interest of time, so we can go on to some of the other ones. Risk management. And the thing I wanted to talk about here, it says, what new opportunities, such as new intended use cases, have been enabled by Gen AI, and what new controls may be needed to mitigate those risks? So we talked about risk previously. One thing I wanted to kind of discuss here is like why are virtual scribes way more prevalent now than they used to be? I think it's because pre large language model or pre AI, we'll say, it was really expensive to do that. It didn't work as well, and there wasn't like a clear financial or technical or like a clear benefit from doing it. And now it's like so easy that a lot of people are doing it. So it just kind of unlocked the floodgate for just everyone can call, like OpenAI chat API, transcribe it, and then toss it in chat GPT. And there does seem to be like a business need that comes out the other end of it. So it's like unblocking all those things. I think that's the answer to like, why are there these new opportunities? And there's probably more like it where before it was hard, but now like the value chain gets unlocked a very steps along the way. And like that's why we have so much more adoption on that now. Talk about risk. Like I think this is another dimension to like the risk thing we talked about here. Like this is talking about how would it be detected, and then this is more about like how would those errors be used clinically. I think some things like the DNR status, which stands for do not resuscitate, like I think this is really important to get right, right? But if you relied on the virtual scribe for this and it said yes instead of no, like that's a really big problem. So not all like outputs could be weighed equally. I think that's another important thing to consider. Is like there's going to be some consequences of an error that is unacceptable. I think like DNR status, allergy list. These are some that I could think of that are really high risk that probably like we shouldn't be really relying on virtual scribes for this. There's other ones that are probably lower risk that are probably okay. Um,
That's a
but yeah, that's
that's a really interesting way to think about it. Yeah, but just see like having a hallucination with the DNR status is definitely problematic.
it's probably not.
It's like
Again, like it's terrible because it's like if you trace these red arrows, right? High likelihood, really shitty consequences, you know.
and
So like
and
that should be like if you ran your risk, it's like if you ran your risk evaluation on this, you should probably get unacceptable, you know.
it's like there's too many novels about DNRs, like where that and the novels that or whatever, right? So it's biased to like always like want to like I don't
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
like something silly like
And
that.
like this also gets into like the performance evaluation aspect of it. Like you can't just weight all of these equally, right? Like if you had in your transcript the allergy list, you should probably weight errors on that way higher than this other stuff, rather than just like a word error rate. Like if you did just like based on characters or something, yes versus no. Well, it's just one character off, but like doesn't really matter. But I'd say like that should be weighted significantly more semantically, like based on the consequences of how it's being used. So it's a really difficult thing to do, but I think it's one that should be considered when you write the function that evaluates how good your algorithm is doing. Maybe this other stuff we'll leave for another day because we only got 5 more minutes, and we have some questions that we can try to get to here. So from Ricky, thanks a lot, Ricky, for your question. So Ricky said it's not unreasonable to think FDA would issue guidance on what to include within a pre-market submission for Gen AI, given how long it's taken to get Gen AI specific guidance for predictive AI, and we're still waiting on AI lifecycle. How long do you think it would take for FDA to get some meaningful guidances out? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know.
I,
I think there's a lot of urgency to this one because there's just so much being used. There's just so much Gen AI just being cowboyed into production right now that perhaps there's like a higher priority. I can ask when I'm there. Like I'll ask them, like, hey, when do you guys think you'll have a
yeah,
finalized guidance? I don't know, David, if you haven't.
we asked them this at the AdvaMed conference in the big FDA symposium, and they kind of were like, no, they didn't really give an answer. But my suspicion is that if there is a guidance at first, it'll be around where they're drawing the boundaries between is it a device or not, like in the clinical decision support. So, because I would think that's like the most immediately like urgent thing to clarify. And then I would imagine then, like supposedly they haven't cleared or they have not cleared any Gen AI devices, Gen AI enabled devices. And they said they hadn't even had any submitted, but I don't know if they're just not allowed to say. I don't quite believe that just from other conversations that we've had. So, or maybe it's just not fully communicated
Yeah,
across the FDA. But my guess is there have been some submissions with Gen AI enabled devices, certainly at least pre-sub.
yeah,
But probably once they've had enough to like actually have a standard, then I could see them doing guidance. But I doubt they're going to do it until they've at least cleared several and they start to have some consensus internally on like what's reasonable to expect. So I don't know. That'd be my guess, but it's just a guess.
yeah. I'm kind of reading between the lines about like the current document we had currently. Like it seems like they're pushing a lot more into the post market, which I haven't like I know post market surveillance is definitely on FDA's mind, but I think this time around maybe they'll actually put something out sooner with the strings attached. Have to have a strong post market surveillance plan in order to get this cleared. I think that's where they're going to. So maybe it'll be sooner than that. Like it's not going to be reactive as it probably was in the past, but maybe it'll be a bit more proactive because they have the assurances that the post market surveillance is happening. I don't know.
But I think one issue there is just their authority to enforce post-market stuff. Like I don't know, like it seems like they're kind of stuck a little bit in that they have the authority to do this big pre-market check, but like
Mm,
I'm not really that aware of how this works on the legal side, but like I know they do audits of your QMS, but like what authority would they have to enforce that you're doing post-market surveillance unless it's specifically in the special controls for new product code? Um, but
Yeah.
I know that Troy, I forget his last name, but the director of the digital health group that was at AdvaMed, I think he had said that they needed more statutory authority to implement the
Mm.
post-market stuff that they would like to do. But I to be honest, I need to read and think about this a little more to be sure. So take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for your question, Richie. And we got one more question from Richie. The quality prompts could play a key role with respect to output generated by Gen AI. Do you think developing something like a prompting guide could be part of device labeling to help users with prompting? Yeah, I think so. I think having clear instructions to user and like and definitely educating them on how to best use AI to reduce the chances of 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 these hallucinations. I think that's going to be important. And this also touches on what FDA is saying, or what FDA is calling the open-ended inputs and open-ended outputs. To them, that's like the highest level of risk and the highest chance that it could be misused, highest chance that the predicate creep and all that stuff happens. So I think like the prompting guide is most relevant when you have an open-ended input. And that's also probably the most difficult one to get FDA cleared right now. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So we're already 2 minutes over, but I think we had a great conversation. Had some excellent questions. Thanks a lot for your participation, everybody. And yeah, I think we'll just continue this conversation. I'm not sure if we'll have this next week because I'll be out. But we'll definitely let you guys know. Yeah, please have a look out for any posts there. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining. We hopefully you enjoyed, and yeah, please consider risks so that you can make devices that you would use on yourself and your family. Um, and if that's true, keep it pragmatic, keep it simple.
Thanks, Yujan. I thought it was a great topic. But
Thanks. Yep. Talk to y'all later.